presentation will have 4 steps. Part 1 will be the events that lead to the Glass-Steagall Act, Part 2 Glass-Steagall Act, and Part 3 the events that lead strengthening the Glass-Steagall Act, and Part 4 the events that lead to the weakening the Glass-Steagall Act. So before starting, the events that led to the Glass-Steagall Act was looking at the economical model that the United States had. The classical economics model, which believes that invisible hand balances the supply and demand in the market and no government intervention. Because if you look at the stock market crash, we can see that the government regulation was so bad and so not strict, it ended up to the stock market crash. So some critics believe that it was a classical model the United States economy was running on. Later, if you look at the stock market crash, 1929, we can see that the price of the stocks dropped suddenly, almost 80% from 20s to 29. It ended up giving a rise to chaos in the banking system. Chaos in the banking system is characterized, banks were not able to collect their loans. What happened is next, once the banks couldn't collect their loans, they failed to pay back their money for their depositors. And the other worse was that banks themselves were actively involved in investing in the securities. Glass-Steagall Act of 1930 should not be confused with the main Glass-Steagall Act of 1933. It just allowed, gave the currency to the Federal Reserve and gave a discount window for the government bonds. Right on the same period of the Glass-Steagall Act, Securities Act of 1933 was passed. The idea was, if before the securities could be registered in the local state laws, which could give, due to the gaps in the laws, state laws, some could take an advantage and underwrite a security that had a low credit ratings. This law was banned, and now everybody had to disclose more detailed information and register with the federal government. Keynesian economics is roughly the same period. Some critics believe that is the startup of the Glass-Steagall Act. Some believe that this was the period when more government regulation, which is the core idea of the Keynesian economics, is more government regulation. As we can see, the Glass-Steagall Act brings more government regulation and intervention. Now, Glass-Steagall Act of 1933, what was the reason behind of it? Right in this period, almost 5,000 banks failed. President Roosevelt decided to close all the banks for 4 days. Almost 4,000 of those banks permanently went out of the business, and number of depositors' money was lost. And number of tons of money was invested in the stock market. What was the reason? There was a main reason now recently is viewed as a conflict of interest. What was happening is commercial banks trying to compete with the investment banks. This competition led commercial banks trying to underwrite more securities with low credit ratings, which was a conflict of interest. Another conflict of interest is coming when commercial banks are acting as a lender and underwriter. Imagine a company comes and borrows the money from the bank, and then later on asks the bank to underwrite their security. And then bank's aim is to underwrite the security in order to gain the money, the money that they lended. So this is another conflict of interest. Rajan economists found actually main defaults on the commercial bank underwriting comes from their affiliates, because affiliates would get a bonuses from the commercial banks, which was another conflict of interest, in order aiming try to underwrite as much as they could because their bonuses will increase, and underwrite this low credit securities and issue them, and then deceitfully making the investors to invest in the stocks. Now, events that took and strengthened the Glass-Steagall Act was the Security and Exchange Act of 1934. It aimed to make a clear, the idea was efficient market hypothesis, to make sure that investors have a clear information regarding the situation or the bank or company was underwriting the security. Some argue that the Congress didn't make, the revenues of the investors didn't increase, but the idea of the Congress was not to increase the revenue of the investors. The idea was to make sure that there's a clear inflow of information so investors could make a smart decision on their investments. The another act was Federal Depository Insurance Act that was supporting the Glass-Steagall Act. as you can see, the banks, when they failed, they were not able to pay back the depositors' money. This act, until 2010, for per bank and for on per bank account for per depositor holder, insured up to $100,000. But after 2012, it increased to $250,000. Now, events that took that was weakening the Glass-Steagall Act, the Depository Institution Deregulation and Monetary Control Act, 1980s. It abolished the Regulation Q that had a restriction on ceiling interest rates on the banking system, which only were mainly aimed for the thrift saving institutions. Garnett-Saint-Germain Act was another act that weakened the Glass-Steagall Act. The idea gave again to commercials that allowed them to engage in commercial activities and earn their revenues, which, as you know, the Glass-Steagall Act completely prohibited the commercial banks to underwriting activities and completely stopped the investment banks accepting any deposits. Now, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, this man was the main mastermind that eventually will repeal the Glass-Steagall Act. He was an advocate of the deregulation, not only deregulation for the Glass-Steagall Act, he was also a very strong advocate of deregulation in the derivatives market. He was the main guy who made the interpretation of the Glass-Steagall Act. Initially in 1987, it allowed the banks, commercial banks, to get their revenues 5% from the investment activities. Later in 1996, this increased to 25%. Once it was 1996, number of banks started decreasing because there were already intentions to mergers and acquisitions. And once the Travelers Insurance Group and the Citigroup planned to merge and form the Citigroup, number of phone calls by their CEOs were made to Alan Greenspan, and Alan Greenspan was eventually able to convince the Bill Clinton to pass and repeal the Glass-Steagall Act. Now finally, the Glass-Steagall Act was repealed in 1999, and Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act came active. As you can see, that the restrictions against the combination of banking, securities, and insurance corporations for financial institutions were lifted up. What was the problem now? The problem was everything was handled under one roof. Mergers, acquisitions, things got really complicated, and again, conflicts of interest because different parties viewed their positions different in the corporations, in the mergers, and it eventually caused a chaos. Besides this, they couldn't catch up with the new innovative financial instruments in the market. So what happened is, in new financial innovations were the derivatives instrument that were already in the market, and they caused more bubble merging in the market, and it ended up with a financial crisis of 2007 and 2009. Now, Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Consumer Protection Act, it's kind of viewed as a rebirth of the Glass-Steagall Act. Was proposed by the Volcker, who was actually a strongly opponent of the Alan Greenspan in '87's. The idea is it will bring a significant change, but it's not as strict as the Glass-Steagall Act. The idea is that any investment authorities that own banks, it will ban them to actively involving in hedging, because hedging might be a very speculative market. And also it bans them to investing in private equities and limiting their liabilities. But a number of already states, the last one was Kansas, last month already sued this act because they believe that it's not legal and it's not valid. So we don't really know how the future of this act will work. Time will just show it. Now the conclusion, as we can see, the Glass-Steagall Act had a huge impact for almost over 50 years. Country didn't really encounter a major recession, banking recession, since the Great Depression period. Once the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act passed, 8 years later, the country encountered almost the same, like some critics believe, almost the same hard situation the country had in the Great Depression period was the crisis of 2007. So Glass-Steagall Act, even though government had a strong impact, it was important because, as we can see, that government's position slowed down certain things in the aspects in the financial markets, getting too inefficient and making them less complicated. even though Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act gave more independence to the financial markets, the development was really high, but the period lifespan was only about 8 years. Here's the works cited. If you have any questions.
We do have time for a few questions.
Yes.
I'm just curious, how do you feel about too big to fail as far as businesses go?
Well, that was the idea of the derivatives market when the acquisitions and mergers started. They believed that they will be operating efficiently, but again, the conflicts of interest, because in the mergers, the number of corporations merged, they had their own aspects, their own views, trying to speculate in the market. And too big to fail is, imagine, if you go back in the old days, if I wanted to purchase a house, I'll go to the bank, they'll issue me a loan, and I'll be the borrower. But then what happened is, once the banks did give the loan, they started selling it to the third parties. And eventually things got out of the control. And they thought even the AIG trying to insure these derivatives failed. Because it was all about the conflicts of interest. And the funny thing is, this shows sometimes that how government is extremely corrupted. All those guys, they ended up earning billions and walking out just without any punishment.
I think the original Glass-Steagall Act was too strict in the late 80s when institutions were allowed to derive part of their assets from the markets and things like that. Do you think that was good, or do you think that the Glass-Steagall Act was right on?
I think Glass-Steagall Act was extremely good act, because if you look at the early 20s, the country was developing extremely fast, new innovations. They invented the airplane, radio, and stuff. The stock market was skyrocketing. But since there was not a strict regulation act that people knew that what are the consequences of whatever they do, and in the terms of Glass-Steagall Act, separation was necessary, because you want everybody to mind their own business. You don't want number of parties coming together and trying to do something. I think Glass-Steagall Act was an excellent act, but unfortunately I don't really think U.S. government would be ever able to go back to that act, because the corporations are so powerful in this country that they would never let that happen again. Because all their relationships with the Congress and the parliamentarians, I don't really think that it will be ever possible. Because I know that already at least 17 or 18 states filed a lawsuit regarding the Dodd-Frank Act, which is not actually, it's really, compared to Glass-Steagall Act, it's a lot softer than what Glass-Steagall Act was.
All right, well, thank you very much.